In May 1940, the French army was considered the best in the world. It had almost 3 million men, approximately 4,000 tanks, and 3,000 state-of-the-art aircraft. The Nazi forces surprised everyone when, in just 6 weeks, they completely destroyed the French, along with the rest of their allies. But how did the Germans win so effectively and quickly? Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will answer this question. Stay with us to understand how the best army on the planet fell so quickly to the overwhelming Nazi forces. After conquering Poland on October 6, 1939, Adolf Hitler already had his hungry eyes on his next target, France. When he informed his generals which country would be invaded next, most of them became alarmed. The French would not be as easy to defeat as the Polish soldiers. They were a professional, experienced, and very numerous army, considered by many to be one of the best in Europe. They also had the Maginot Line, a series of defensive fortifications along the entire Franco-German border, which was considered impenetrable. Worse still for the Germans, this time they would not have the element of surprise. The risk of their forces being crushed immediately was very high. Hitler, however, was not intimidated and ordered his generals to begin planning the offensive. But his ambition went much further. Not only was France to fall, Belgium and the Netherlands had to suffer the same fate. And it was essential that all three nations be attacked in a single operation. Thus, the United Kingdom would be left as Germany's only rival, cut off from any kind of help. At first, the commanders of the Nazi forces proposed a plan similar to the one the German Empire had used during the First World War, to enter France through the Belgian Ardennes forest, and there face its enemy. But the Führer rejected this idea outright. He did not want a repeat of the previous conflict, since it had ended with the German defeat. Instead, he wanted to take advantage of one of the strong points of his army, the armored divisions. By 1939, most European countries had tanks and similar vehicles in their forces, but most of them had not updated the way they used them since the years of the Great War. They served simply as support for infantry units, without any independence on the battlefield. The Third Reich, however, had other ideas in mind, ideas that it was eager to show to the whole world. The plans for the conquest of Western Europe underwent so many changes that they were only approved on February 24, 1940, almost 5 months after the initial discussions. The final operation became known as the Yellow Plan and was devised primarily by General Erich von Manstein. The German forces would be divided in two. Army Corps B would attack through northern Holland and Belgium, when the Allies sent their fighters to meet them. This side, for its part, was fully confident in its defensive capabilities. The British and French also expected the main German attack to come from the north, to avoid the Maginot Line. As for the Ardennes, they thought it was simply impenetrable, so there was no reason to send forces there. But even before the German offensive began, fractures within the Allies were beginning to appear. Belgium and the Netherlands, thinking they could still prevent Hitler from invading, did not allow the forces of the United Kingdom and France to enter their territories, seeking not to provoke the Führer. In doing so, they forced the Western powers to abandon the initiative and only attack if they were attacked first. The Allied armies included almost 4 million men, who were positioned on the border between France and the Netherlands. Not only did they outnumber Germany, which mobilized its approximately 3 million soldiers, but they also outnumbered it in vehicles, technology, and experience, or at least that is what they thought. Finally, the day came. On May 10, 1940, the same day Winston Churchill took office as British Prime Minister, the German army launched its Yellow Plan. Army Corps B crossed the border with Holland and Belgium en masse, destroying everything in its path. The small Dutch forces could do little to stop the advance of the Reich. By the time the French crossed the border, their allies' men were in retreat. On May 14th, already displaying the brutality that would bring them infamy, the Germans mercilessly bombed the city of Rotterdam, killing approximately 800 civilians. The next day, frightened by this unprecedented slaughter, the Dutch government announced its surrender. The Belgian forces, which now had some French reinforcements, were able to temporarily slow down the German tanks, but the Allies were unable to take advantage of this situation. The huge number of civilians fleeing the battlefields greatly hampered their advance, and the opportunity for a counteroffensive disappeared. The outlook was not encouraging. Many of their generals were realizing that they had seriously underestimated their enemy, and things were about to get worse. While the Germans, French, and Belgians fought fiercely in the north, the German Army Corps A began its advance through the Ardennes. The few Allied forces there proved completely unable to stop the onslaught of Hitler's battleships. They did not think it was possible for hundreds of tanks to break through such dense vegetation, so they had no defenses capable of stopping them. With the death toll mounting rapidly, they had to retreat back to the cities of northern France. The Allied generals were bitterly surprised. Their vehicles were superior in armor and weapons to the relatively weak German panzers, yet they were dropping like flies, along with an alarming number of soldiers. They could not understand the reason, but in reality, it was very simple. The French and British saw the tanks as mere support units. In contrast, the Germans had made the battleships a key part of their new doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or as they called it.
The world was staggered by the speed with which the German armored columns moved. What was the secret that enabled armies to move so far so rapidly? The secret lay in the organization of the striking spearhead. Armored forces came first, closely followed by motorized divisions, which peeled off, forming solid walls. And through the corridor thus formed, raced the supply trucks to feed the ever-lengthening column.
Added to this innovative tactic was the chaos caused by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Its planes relentlessly attacked Allied supply columns, destroying much of their resources and killing hundreds of their men. The morale of many French soldiers collapsed as they saw themselves vastly outnumbered by their enemy. It was common for entire divisions to retreat, despite not being ordered to do so, or even some to desert. The generals demanded that the British send more forces, since at that time there was only the expeditionary force in continental Europe, which had no armored divisions. But in London, more and more voices declared that France was already lost, and that Churchill should concentrate on defending the local territory. Only a few units were dispatched, but they would not be enough to face the enemy. The Germans reaped victory after victory. By May 15th, they had positioned themselves south of the Allied forces and began the second phase of their plan. With surprising speed, they began to head towards the French coast, with the aim of completely surrounding their rivals. The German tanks were capable of covering hundreds of kilometers in a single day. The French forces, seeing the clouds of dust caused by the armored battalions, lost all hope and ability to organize. The Nazi vehicles barely slowed down to confront them, as with just a few cannon shots they were capable of causing a massive retreat. On the 20th of May, the Germans reached the beaches of the English Channel, a border territory between France and Great Britain. More than 1 million Allied soldiers were trapped in the pincers of the German forces. At that moment, Churchill realized that France was lost. Despite the resentment shown by his partner's generals, he ordered his men to head for the coasts of Dunkirk, where a massive evacuation would take place. He knew that Hitler's next target was the United Kingdom, and he needed every available fighter to mount the defense of his nation. He did not want to sacrifice men in what he saw as a lost cause. It was here that Hitler made one of the most controversial decisions of the entire Second World War. The tanks' good pace, in addition to tiring their crews, had caused them to outnumber the infantry units. For some of the German generals, including Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Corps A, this put their armored divisions in a very vulnerable position for Allied counterattacks. Therefore, he believed that the vehicles should be slowed down. However, other military leaders urged that they should press on and hit their enemies while they were weakened and retreating, before they were able to organize an evacuation. Much to the chagrin of the latter, on 24th May, the Führer ordered a temporary pause in the advance of the tanks. For many historians, this was their biggest mistake, as the Allies had just enough time to begin their escape 2 days later.
Later in the war, Hitler will try to cover up his mistake and say that he wanted to avoid humiliating Britain in view of peace talks. After the war, von Rundstedt will say that Hitler gives the order, but this is a lie. In reality, von Rundstedt gives the order to stop, but tells his subordinates that the order came from Hitler so that they will obey.
British and French ships and even civilian boats approached the coast to assist the desperate men, while German planes attacked from the skies. By June 4, 1940, almost 350,000 soldiers had been rescued. Despite the tens of thousands of casualties sacrificed to ensure the evacuation, the operation was a success. The Allies had the necessary fighters to continue resisting the Third Reich's plans for world domination. For many, if the Germans had not paused their attacks, the war could have ended right there, on the shores of Dunkirk. But although the evacuation was successful, the Allied situation in Europe was disastrous. On May 28th, Belgium had announced its surrender. After Dunkirk, with the British back in the British Isles, the only ones capable of opposing the Nazis were the battered French. But they had lost their best forces in the encirclement, and only their much less experienced reserves remained. They were located south of the German armored divisions, on the Somme and Aisne rivers. If these defenses fell, Paris was at risk of being captured by the invaders. Some attacks caused a large number of casualties among the Germans, including many destroyed tanks. However, they could not stop their advance. On the 5th of June 1940, the Nazis began crossing both rivers to deal the final blow to the already hopeless French. The now united A and B Army Corps headed towards Paris, while the newly formed C Army Corps would attack the forces still defending the Maginot Line. This would prevent possible counterattacks in their rear. The Germans, who had begun their campaign outnumbered, now had almost twice as many divisions as their enemies, due to casualties and evacuations. Villages in the French communes where the Allies were holed up were razed to the ground under the chains and guns of the panzers. The generals of the defenders, knowing that the fate of Paris and their nation was in their hands, ordered their men to fight to the death. The objective was simple: kill as many Nazis as possible before being felled by enemy bullets. For many of them, the war was already lost. The Germans, for their part, used this as an excuse to commit terrible massacres, both of civilians and enemy soldiers.
In some places, the Germans also murder French African colonial soldiers after they've surrendered. In fact, overall in the campaign, SS and Wehrmacht troops kill at least 3,000 French African and nearly 200 British and French prisoners, and several massacres of civilians take place, like at Vingt and Wigny. At one of the massacres of African troops, a German officer explains his actions to his French counterpart.
An inferior race does not deserve to fight such a civilizing race as the German race.
Despite fierce local resistance, which caused numerous casualties among the attackers, the German battleships once again outnumbered the French. By June 9th, June 14th, 1940, Paris fell. To prevent its destruction, the French forces abandoned the capital entirely. Thus, the invaders entered without resistance, bringing death and barbarism to the city, considered by many to be the most beautiful in the world. On June 25th, the remaining surviving forces signed the armistice that ended the fighting. In just 6 weeks, what had been considered the most powerful army in the world was almost completely destroyed. Approximately 90,000 French soldiers and civilians were killed, while 8 million lost their homes. For some Allied generals, the blame for such a sudden defeat fell on the cowardice of the combatants. Others pointed accusingly at outdated tactics and the incompetence of commanders. They were unable to cope with the strategic advances of the Germans, who combined the explosive action of their tanks with the lethality of their aircraft. The Allies, with their morale at rock bottom, lived their darkest moment. Many already considered that the entire war had been lost on the French fields. Meanwhile, German propaganda celebrated the victory as a sign of their invincibility. But this brought with it a disadvantage, which would be clearly seen in the battles to come. Hitler and his generals greatly overestimated the capacity of their forces and ignored the mistakes made in combat. France was lost, but the war continued. During World War II, there were no fiercer rivals in the entire conflict than Adolf Hitler, leader of Germany, and Joseph Stalin, head of the Soviet Union. The brutal battles between the two countries left tens of millions dead, with blood spilled over stretches of thousands of miles. However, the relationship between these powers was not always the same. At the beginning of the war, and despite their diametrically opposed ideologies, they were faithful allies, fighting and invading other countries together. However, both knew that it was only a matter of time before this bond would be torn apart. There was no doubt that blood would flow. The only question was who would strike the first blow, and who would emerge victorious. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the intriguing pact between two of the most sinister figures in history, Stalin and Hitler, from the creation of this alliance to its explosive destruction. A few months before the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Hitler was preparing to continue his campaign of conquest. Austria and the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia were already in his hands, invaded and annexed without any resistance. The other powers in Europe, mainly the United Kingdom and France, had weakly protested against these operations, but their complaints were ignored by the Führer. The next target of the Third Reich was in the east. It was Poland, a prize much coveted by the Nazi leader, who sought to expand his empire into this territory. But unlike his previous victims, the Poles made it clear that if they dared to cross the border, they would be greeted with a storm of bullets. On this occasion, the British and French also threatened that if the country's sovereignty was endangered, war would be declared. Hitler was not very worried about this scenario, however. He did not believe in the threats from the Allies and thought that even if they were true, his armies would not be able to resist the modern German forces. But there was one aspect of the situation that kept him awake at night. If war began, what would his main enemy, the Soviet Union, do? Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Eurasian giant, asked himself the same question about his rival. He had no doubt about what Nazism thought of him and his people, made up largely of Slavs and Jews. The party's ideology considered them inferior and subhuman, unworthy of sharing the planet with the superior Aryan race. In turn, communism threatened traditional Western values and was a direct path to barbarism. The survival of the German man would only be guaranteed when they were destroyed. War between the two nations was inevitable.
Here we have a popular illustrated history of so-called racial science that was published in Germany in the 1930s. So we have the pure Germanic youth as opposed to the degenerate Jewish youth. On the right-hand side here is a rather crude world map purporting to show revolutions that were instigated by Jews and their associated Freemasons. So we have here, in fact, a perfect illustration of Hitler's view of the Untermensch, the subhuman, conflation of the Jew, the Slav and the communist. These were the very peoples that were now ripe for subjugation and indeed for extermination in Germany's eastward cultural mission.
The territory Hitler wanted could only be obtained through war. Knowing this, Stalin tried to negotiate treaties with the United Kingdom and France to achieve a defensive alliance, guaranteeing that if one was invaded, the others would come to its aid. But these agreements never came about. The Soviets suspected that the Allies wanted the Russians and Germans to engage in a long and costly war, leaving the rest of Europe free of hostilities. For his part, Hitler did not want such an alliance to be cemented, as he feared facing a two-front war. That is why he resorted to a plan as desperate as it was surprising. He would establish a pact with his greatest enemy before any other treaty could be made. Thus began the rapprochement between the foreign ministers of Germany, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov. To the surprise of many, who perhaps expected that the negotiations between these rivals would not prosper, they were carried out very quickly. On August 23, 1939, with the approval of their respective heads of state, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. It guaranteed 10 years of peace between the two countries. In this way, Hitler could invade Poland and even engage in a war with the Allies without risk of Soviet intervention. For his part, Stalin would have time to organize his Red Army for the conflict against the Germans, which, despite the treaty, he still believed impossible to avoid.
In the Kremlin, Stalin proposed a toast.
I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. I should therefore like to drink his health.
But like Hitler, Stalin was also acting from fear that Hitler would attack him. That evening, he told his inner circle,
Of course, it's all a game to see who can fool whom. He thinks he's outsmarted me, but actually it's I who's tricked him.
But there was a secret clause in the pact. According to it, Eastern Europe would be divided into two regions, one under German rule and the other controlled by the communists. Stalin demanded Finland, the Baltic states, and a large part of Romania. The rest could fall into Nazi hands. Poland, for its part, would be torn apart and divided between the two, with each keeping half. After the assurance of successful negotiations, Hitler set his plans in motion again. On the 1st of September 1939, just 8 days after the signing of the treaty, German soldiers crossed the border into Poland, thus beginning the Second World War. The defenders could do little against the tanks and a much larger, better trained and equipped German army. Although the British and French kept their promise and declared war on the Reich, they did not send men, and the Poles were forced to retreat further and further into their own territory. The battle seemed lost. The defenders believed that the situation could not get any worse, but they were wrong. On September 17th, everything went out of control. From the other end of the country, the Red Army also invaded Poland. The locals, confused by the new enemy, in many cases did not even open fire as the Soviets advanced into the heart of the nation. On October 6th, just over a month after the attack began, the Polish forces were completely defeated by this lethal alliance. Both conquerors began their processes of terror against the civilian population. Members of the German SS massacred tens of thousands of Poles, most of them of Jewish origin, in just a few weeks. They were not the only ones. Stalin ordered the same to be done. This happened, for example, in the Katyn massacre, a series of mass murders that ended the lives of more than 20,000 people. All of them, belonging to the intellectual, political, and military spheres of Poland, were shot in cold blood. It was not until 1943 that the macabre mass graves where their bodies were buried would be discovered. For the nations of the West, this scenario was completely hopeless. Stalin and Hitler seemed to be staunch partners, ready to deploy their territorial ambitions to the rest of Europe. And although the Soviet leader had not declared war on the United Kingdom or France, he could not be counted on to mutually destroy the Führer, as had been the original plan of the Allies. According to some members of the German leadership, the Nazi leader was confident of Soviet loyalty, but the truth is that Stalin wasted no time in fortifying his positions, preparing for a German invasion that he still considered inevitable. He began to mobilize his forces towards the countries that had been under his sphere of influence, according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with the aim of creating zones that would act as a barrier against Germany. The Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were forced to choose between peaceful or violent annexation. All three decided not to take up arms. Finland, on the other hand, offered fierce resistance, and on November 30th, 1939, the Winter War began. After 3 months, the Finns had to surrender, and although they ceded territory to the Soviet Union, the country was not conquered in its entirety. Stalin had not achieved his objective, and during the brutal conflict, the Red Army lost around 125,000 soldiers. This was not the first time that the world had witnessed the incompetence of the communist forces, whose most experienced generals had been shot under Stalin's orders in the previous years, during the Great Purge that began in 1936. Although in theory they were his allies, Hitler was glad for the blood shed by the Russians. The Führer ended up convincing himself that, when the time came for their elimination, they would not pose a real danger to the Third Reich. But for the moment, his objectives were different. On May 10, 1940, the German army launched a massive invasion of its western neighbors. France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg were attacked simultaneously. Despite all the defensive preparations they had made, within just 6 weeks, they were defeated and their countries conquered. British forces, which had been sent to assist their allies, were eventually driven off the continent, but not before suffering terrible casualties. With the French surrender, the United Kingdom became the only force still standing, opposing the rule of the Third Reich. For the Nazis, this was a huge triumph. For Stalin, it was terrible news.
Nikita Khrushchev, later Russia's prime minister, recalled Stalin's reaction to Hitler's lightning victories.
I remember being with Stalin. He was extremely nervous. He was racing around, cursing like a cab driver. He cursed the French. He cursed the English. How could they allow Hitler to defeat them, to crush them? Stalin not only saw the superiority of the German army, he knew that the Germans sensed our weakness because of the war we had fought with Finland.
Stalin wanted the Western nations to destroy each other in a devastating war, but the swift German victory shattered his hopes. With no strong enemy in the West, he knew it was only a matter of time before Hitler's ambitious eyes would turn to the East. But his armies were not ready to deal with the powerful Nazi war machine. They needed more time. In those moments of doubt, he received a letter from the then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In the message, he urged an alliance between their countries, appealing to what they both knew. The Soviet Union would be the new target of Nazism. Stalin, however, decided to demonstrate his loyalty to the Führer and informed him of the Englishman's intentions. But this turned out to be a huge mistake. After France's crushing defeat, Hitler was surprised that the United Kingdom had not tried to negotiate peace with Germany. Added to this was the fact that Franklin Roosevelt, upon being re-elected President of the United States, denounced German ideology in his acceptance speech. The Nazi leader felt that these two countries would be the core of a new alliance, created in order to defeat his forces. The revelation that the Soviet Union had been invited to join only cemented his suspicions. If Stalin accepted, his position would no longer be so weak, and he would be able to stand up to the powerful German army. Thus, Hitler came to a brutal conclusion. The communists had to be crushed immediately. However, other campaigns in the Western theater of operations, such as the Air Battle of England, kept him busier than he would have liked. By early 1941, however, his plans were already in motion. Although the United Kingdom was still in the war, the Führer thought it was no risk, and despite Roosevelt's fiery speeches, the United States still remained neutral. It was time for Nazi Germany's most ambitious operation, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin received numerous reports from his spies, warning him of troop movements on the German border. Even Churchill himself shared similar reports from his own agents, but the communist leader chose to ignore them. He did not think that the Reich's forces would get involved in a two-front war, so he maintained that as long as the United Kingdom remained steadfast in the conflict, its territory would be safe. But his way of thinking was not the same as that of his rival.
Stalin was trusting Hitler to act rationally. And to fight Britain and Russia at the same time was clearly irrational. But Stalin failed to realize that despite their similarities, there was one profound difference between him and Hitler, which made his perfect logic irrelevant. He himself was a methodical, calculating, hard-working man, a master of detail, personally signing death lists at one extreme, and at the other, keeping the tiniest details of gold production in his notebook. Hitler, by contrast, was at heart an idle dreamer.
On June 22, 1941, Hitler ordered the start of Operation Barbarossa. From the Finnish border in the north to the Romanian border in the south, Axis forces invaded the Soviet Union on a scale never before seen. Stalin, who thought he had more time to prepare his men, was surprised by the brutality of his former ally. Within days, tanks advanced hundreds of miles inland, destroying everything in their path. Entire villages were burned, along with all their inhabitants, while German planes dropped tons of explosives on the cities. Within weeks, Soviet deaths reached terrifying numbers. Stalin, a victim of fear and fury, ordered the execution of some of the generals in charge of the initial defense. Clearly, this did not improve his dire situation, The German officers, witnessing the disorganization and chaos that reigned in the Russian ranks, considered the campaign to be short-lived. Some informed Hitler that they would be at the gates of Moscow in 4 months at the most. Others spoke of only 2 weeks. The Führer was happy with the way events were unfolding. He no longer had to pretend to be an ally of a people and an ideology that he saw as inferior. He also believed that, once the Soviet Union was crushed, the United Kingdom would be quick to sign a peace treaty, since German supremacy would be demonstrated, and if they did not do so, the resources that would be taken from the communists, such as steel and oil sources, would allow Churchill to be defeated as well. But there was an unforeseen event in the German plans. With their armies engaged in a war against the Soviets, the British could go on the offensive, and so they did in North Africa, where fighting between the Allies and their enemies was still ongoing. The German situation worsened even more when, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. This was the spark the Americans needed to ignite their fighting spirit, and they finally joined the war against the Axis forces. Meanwhile, the Red Army, despite its initial disasters, was proving to be a more feared enemy than expected. Stalin and his generals managed to quickly mobilize reserves of men, and despite the terrible casualties suffered, there were still fighters ready to face the invaders. They also managed to move their heavy industries from the western cities beyond the Ural Mountains. In this way, the resources the Germans so craved were kept out of their reach, and the locals were able to continue building the war material necessary to fight. After 4 months, the deadline that several German officers had set as the maximum point of Russian resistance, they had not been able to meet almost any of their objectives. Moscow remained firmly in Soviet hands, and now a patriotic fervor circulated in the men and women of the Union. Everyone would do their part to eliminate the Nazi aggressors.
Некоторые перепуганы интеллигентики. Не так страшен черт, как его малюют. Кто может отрицать, то наша Красная Армия не раз обращал паническое бегство в хваленные немецкие войска. Если судить не по фастинг за армином немецких пропагандистов, а по действительному доложению, Германии нетрудно будет понять, что немецко-фашистские захватчики стоят перед катастрофой.
With the entry of the United States into the conflict, the main axis of the anti-Nazi resistance was formed, made up of Americans, British, and Soviets. In this way, Hitler ended up being the cause of creating the alliance that he so feared, and which led him to betray his former partner. Beginning in 1942, with the joint operations of the Western powers and the Communists, the German situation only worsened. While German morale and resources rapidly diminished, Soviet fighting spirit continued to increase. When the invaders tried to conquer Stalingrad in the middle of that year, their forces were devastated by the resistance of the defenders. Hitler, suffering from a shortage of soldiers and equipment, was forced to order a retreat. In the following years, all the territory they had conquered was liberated until the fighting reached German soil itself. The Führer, cornered and desperate, succumbed to his paranoia, which ended up taking him to the grave in April 1945. On September 1st, 1939, dawn brought with it a deafening roar that shattered the tranquility of the fields of Poland. So many years of accumulated tension had just exploded. The sound of engines advancing to the beat of Adolf Hitler completely dominates the scene. Nazi Germany has set its war machine in motion, and the smell of death begins to spread. This is the first chapter of a story of horrors that will keep the entire world in suspense. The Western powers that hope to avoid a conflict no longer have a choice. They must face the brutality of the forces of the Third Reich, which with each step it takes, unleashes all the German violence that has been cultivated for years. In this new military history video, we will discover everything about the fierce invasion that meant the beginning of the Second World War. Stay with us and discover how the Führer's troops made their enemies tremble, plunging all of Europe into darkness.
Wszystko się zawaliło. Belki to ciężkie wszystko, to zaczęło się walić. Chwila tylko błysk, huk i kurz, pełne usta tynku. I my w tej ciemności. I się krzyczymy, kto jeszcze żyje, kto jest. To straszna rzecz.
The conflict between 1939 and 1945 was the most destructive in the entire history of mankind. Although the Great Battle began with the German invasion of Poland, that event was the result of many years of tension. And to understand it, we must ask ourselves, why did Hitler choose that country to begin his brutal expansion plan? The short answer would be that the Führer was a ruthless dictator who dreamed of conquering all of Europe. The annexation of Polish territory was simply one more step in his plan to achieve total domination. Poland was an opponent without enough power to resist an attack by the German army, and as the Nazi leader calculated, the other powers of the continent would not be able to intervene in time. However, the background is much more complex, and to understand it, we must travel back several years to the First World War. That conflict ended with the defeat of the Germans, which was confirmed by the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The peace agreement ended the conflict and established several points that caused a feeling of humiliation in the Germans. One of them was the reduction of their army to only 100,000 men, in addition to the prohibition of recruiting new soldiers. The nation was practically demilitarized, but that was not all. On the other hand, when the treaty was signed, the victorious Allies divided the territory that had been part of Germany. They also did the same with that of their war partner Austria-Hungary, and with the Russian Empire that had disintegrated under Bolshevik control. A series of countries emerged from there, including Poland, which had last existed as an independent state in 1795. Another was Czechoslovakia, whose name reflects the decision of the Allies to combine areas dominated by two different ethnic groups, the Czechs and the Slovaks. Hitler despised these new nations. However, he took advantage of them, as both had significant German populations. He feigned a false concern for the welfare of these people as a pretext for demanding territorial concessions. The Führer felt that the Treaty of Versailles not only entailed a huge humiliation for the German people, but also represented an injustice that he was determined to right. The first step was to take back what was his. In 1938, 5 years after his appointment as Chancellor, his desires for expansion slowly began to materialize.
Lastly, Hitler takes on the mission of bringing all German-speaking peoples into the Reich's fold, beginning with those of his homeland. The Anschluss. Austria is annexed and immediately submitted to the same reign of terror as Germany.
German troops entered Austria on March 12, 1938, and with the enthusiastic support of most Austrians, the country was annexed to Germany the next day. There was little international resistance to this, as many saw it as a natural union. However, Hitler's demands on German-speaking areas within Czechoslovakia created a crisis that brought Europe to the brink of war in September of that year. Many Germans living in that nation wanted to rejoin the territory that now represented the Third Reich. Most were in an area along the borders known as the Sudetenland. Hitler threatened to take up arms if these lands were not ceded to him, which raised concerns among the Western powers. Britain and France were in the process of rearming after World War I, so they did not yet feel capable of confronting the dictator with all their might. However, on 27 September 1938, both countries had reluctantly agreed to go to battle if German troops entered Czech soil without an international agreement. The next day, the Nazi leader agreed to hold a conference to resolve the issue. The proposal was quickly accepted by the French and British, who traveled to Munich to hold talks with the Führer and his main ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. During the meeting, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Neville Chamberlain, tried to find a peaceful solution. He proposed allowing the German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for a peace commitment from Hitler. Thus, although no representative of Czechoslovakia was invited to participate in the talks, the country was forced to cede this territory in view of a scenario that would bring tranquility to Europe. The Munich Agreement eliminated the immediate threat of war, but this anti-war attitude only increased Adolf Hitler's confidence. While the British and French believed they were buying time to prepare for a war, the Führer realized that neither of them would use force to resist further German expansion. In March 1939, Third Reich troops ignored the newly signed treaty and occupied what remained of Czech territory. This convinced the Western Allies that there were no limits to the Nazi leaders' territorial ambitions. There would be no room for further agreements. They had to prevent further German advance into Europe. War was beginning to brew. Meanwhile, the Führer already had his next target in his sights.
Hitler decides to wipe out what he calls the worst monstrosity of the Versailles Treaty, the Danzig Corridor. In 1919, German territory was cut in two in order to give Poland access to the sea. Hitler decides to launch his invasion of Poland and recover Danzig.
While Germany was completing its conquest of Czechoslovakia, another crisis had begun to develop in parallel. With the creation of Poland as a new country after World War I, the victorious Allies also proposed establishing a corridor dug into German territory. In this way, the ancient city of Danzig was transformed into a port administered by the so-called League of Nations to facilitate Polish trade. This created lasting resentment among the Nazis, who in October 1938 had begun efforts to recover the lost city. Third Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop met with the Polish ambassador Józef Lipski to discuss the return of Danzig to Germany. However, there was no significant progress on that request. Talks intensified at a meeting between Hitler and Polish Foreign Minister Józef Beck on 5th January 1939. But the fledgling nation refused to back down. The Führer believed that Danzig belonged to Germany and would fight to reclaim it. Recognizing that Poland was Germany's next target, the British and French authorities offered guarantees to defend Polish independence. These nations had renewed their agreement as allies against the Third Reich in February and began joint military planning. Both countries continued their rearmament process. The British introduced compulsory military service in peacetime for the first time in their history. However, war was still considered a last resort. With this support, Poland's resistance grew stronger. Anti-Nazi messages began to become more frequent on the streets, highlighting the country's courage in confronting Hitler if he decided to attack the territory.
To był raczej obraz propagandy w stosunku do ludności, pokazania, że Polska sobie jest mocnym państwem. W rzeczywistości Polska sobie zdawała sprawę, że jest w stosunku do Niemiec, wojskowo nie ma żadnych szans. To jest kwestia, Polska sobie nigdy nie poradziła z Niemcami, to było w sztabach, w polskich sztabach, w dowództwie polskim było jasne. Dlatego była skazana na sojusze wojskowe z krajami zachodnimi i szczególnie z Francją.
Undaunted by British and French declarations of support, Adolf Hitler ordered preparations for the invasion of Poland in April 1939. He forged ties with Japan and strengthened his military alliance with Italy. His camp was consolidated. The United States, with a giant military power, had passed a neutrality law so as not to be drawn into a new war in Europe. Thus, only one possible obstacle remained in the Führer's plan: the Soviet Union. Everything seemed to indicate that the eruption of Reich forces on Polish territory would sound alarm bells in Moscow. Germany and Russia were historical enemies, having fought each other during the First World War. In addition, Hitler and the leader of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, were at opposite ends of the political spectrum. The Communists and the Nazis had viewed each other with suspicion throughout the 1930s. However, the way the Allies handled the Sudetenland crisis alerted the Soviets. They feared that the Führer would try to annex parts of their country, and they knew that the Western powers, who despised both equally, would be happy to let them fight each other. As a result of these speculations, the Soviet Union agreed to a non-aggression agreement with its historical enemy. Thus, in August 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed the pact that left the authorities in London and Paris perplexed. However, the biggest surprise would be the secret clauses that had been agreed between the two nations. Germany had announced that it was ready to invade Poland, and far from opposing it, the USSR began plans to join the attack from the east. Once the conquest was completed, the confidential part of the agreement stated that the territories would be divided. With this new and unexpected alliance, the Führer no longer had any obstacles to his objective. On September 1st, 1939, his troops began the offensive on the neighboring country.
Hitler is convinced that the French and the British will not take action. Yet the two governments meet immediately and send him an ultimatum demanding that he halt all military action against Poland.
Despite the threats, nothing would stop the Führer. His troops were already on the move, laying waste to everything in their path using an innovative and lethal combat tactic. The invasion of Poland was the stage for the debut of the so-called Lightning War, or Blitzkrieg, a strategy that combined the coordinated use of the different branches of the German military. There, the Air Force known as the Luftwaffe played a crucial role, bombing Polish cities, infrastructure, and military positions from the start. The goal was to destabilize defenses, destroy communications, and spread panic among the civilian population. In turn, soldiers on the ground were organized into armored divisions of powerful panzer tanks and motorized infantry units. These vehicles advanced behind the bombing raids and penetrated deep into rival territory. The Blitzkrieg was based on speed and surprise. German troops avoided prolonged confrontations in strong defensive lines. Instead, they carried out rapid attacks, isolating enemy units and surrounding them. While tanks led the offensive, artillery and conventional infantry forces moved in to consolidate the ground gained and secure control over occupied areas. The well-oiled Nazi machine also benefited from effective communication between its forces, which allowed for fluid maneuvers that were impossible for its adversary to contain. Despite the overwhelming power of the Third Reich, the Poles did their best to resist. However, the differences in armament were enormous. The Germans had a great advantage in armor, artillery, and fighter aircraft. In contrast, Poland's army, although large, was poorly equipped. It had a very limited air force, and its ground units were small and outdated. Many of its troops moved on foot or on horseback, making it difficult to react to the speed of the German attacks.
Hitler unleashes the Wehrmacht, the armed forces of Nazi Germany, onto Poland. Entering battle as if in a bygone age, the Polish cavalry charges the German tanks and is slaughtered.
The initial chaos of the conflict quickly spread over the territory of Poland. The final destination, the capital, Warsaw. Just as Hitler had imagined, the promise of British and French protection had not had any effect. It took 2 days for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Neville Chamberlain, to transmit an announcement informing his nation of what was now inevitable. At 11:15 on 3 September, after receiving no response to the ultimatum sent to the Führer demanding a withdrawal, war was declared against Germany. Faced with the news, the people were frightened and plagued with uncertainty. However, this outcome was not a surprise. Tensions in Europe had been increasing for years despite Britain and France's refusal to accept it. Now it was time to fulfill their promise of assistance to the Poles.
French forces attack on September the 7th, 1939, 4 days after declaring war. This offensive, launched to show public opinion that Poland has not been abandoned, advances 8 kilometers into the Saar region.
Despite this small presence in the fighting, the Allied powers did not launch any significant offensives on the Western Front, which destroyed Polish hopes of an attack that would force the Germans to redeploy their forces. On the contrary, the full power of the Third Reich fell upon Poland. As if that were not enough, the situation became even grimmer on 17th September, when Russian troops began to cross the border from the east. The Polish army was already at a disadvantage, but when the Soviets attacked, the outlook became desperate.
As previously agreed with Hitler, the Soviets have invaded the eastern half of Poland. Here, German and Soviet soldiers are fraternizing, an incongruous sight to say the least. The Nazis hand out flyers that read, "The German army salutes the Red Army of workers and farmers, which it has always held in the highest respect."
The advance of the circumstantial partners was relentless despite the Polish efforts. The defense was fierce, but stopping the joint brutality of the Germans and Soviets proved impossible. The capital of the country was surrounded by the enemy, who launched constant offensives to take control of the city. However, the heroic resistance of the local soldiers delayed that plan. This did not sit well with the Führer, who responded with even greater violence.
On the 25th of September, Hitler orders the bombing of Warsaw. The city is surrounded, but still holding out.
Eventually, lack of supplies and constant German pressure led to the fall of Warsaw on 28 September 1939. Hitler's ambition had managed to take another step towards his goal of conquest. Once the Führer and Stalin had consolidated their joint control over Poland, the Western powers felt less pressure to quickly attack Germany. Along with the capital, the Polish authorities had also succumbed, so there was no government to save from defeat. The Allies controlled the seas and believed they had time on their side. However, what they did not know was that they had allowed the beginning of the bloodiest period in history. The greatest atrocities that humanity had ever seen would soon materialize, and the Polish people were the first experiment.
Hitler and Himmler, the head of the SS, will now take care of Poland by naming the Nazi Hans Frank Governor-General of the occupied Polish provinces, who proclaims, "I have the power of life and death over the Polish people."
According to historians, Poland became the only nation occupied by Hitler in which there was no collaboration between conquerors and conquered. An estimated 5.5 million people died under Nazi rule in their country, half of whom were Jews. That was not all, however, as another 150,000 died under Soviet rule. Nazi propaganda portrayed Poles as oppressors of ethnic Germans in that nation and used this as a pretext to subject the people to the most brutal slavery. Local citizens responded by organizing one of the largest resistance movements in territory occupied by the Third Reich.
Die Juden und die Polen, das waren wirkliche Untermenschen. Das war ganz klar, die galten nichts für die deutschen Besatzer. Sie wollten keine Nation haben mit einem intelligenten oder gebildeten Überbau. Sie wollten eine wirklich niedrige Arbeiterkolonie entwickeln. Das war auch ganz im Sinne meines Vaters.
Poland's suffering was the calling card of the fearsome Nazi regime. However, after the conquest of that territory, several months passed before Hitler's next move. Because of that, the British and French held out hope that they could find a solution to the conflict without unleashing a full-scale war. That illusion vanished when the tanks of the Third Reich began to arrive in Western Europe, from the Netherlands to Belgium, and finally, to France itself. Everyone suffered the savage power of the Germans, and millions of people died as a result of the numerous battles. World War II was underway, and nothing could stop it. Now, after having learned the origins of the most brutal conflict in history, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We hope to see you again in our next military history video.